Travis, thanks for joining me today. Really appreciate you being here.
No problem. Thank you, Brian. Looking forward to the conversation. And of course, thanks to Tim and State of the Net for having me back.
First, I think I probably speak on behalf of everyone here when I say the thing I'm most curious about is what was it like to be fired by President Trump?
A lot of people have now had the experience. I recall it was the Tuesday after inauguration. It was in the evening. And I received an email that purported to be from someone named Trent Morse, a name that I had never heard of before, asking me to resign on behalf of the president or be terminated within 48 hours. And when I received the email, I actually thought it was a joke at first because it came to me at my PCLOB email address. It went to my Cooley email address, and then it went to two random email addresses that have nothing to do with me, but that had would look like my last name in them at a Gmail and Yahoo. And it looked like some guy named Greg. And I have no idea where those two email addresses came from. And so it kind of looked like it was spam there. But then I heard from the other two board members that they received the same email within a minute of my receiving it. It was a little odd at first because literally I think it was the week before I had received a letter from President Biden, thanking me for my service on the PCLOB, to 1 week later receiving a request to resign. And what continues to strike me as interesting about the whole ordeal is that to be on the PCLOB, you have to be, nominated by the president after consultation with the Democratic leadership. You have to be confirmed by the Senate. You have to be, then after your confirmation, you have to be commissioned, right? You have to be appointed to the position itself in the end. And you get a duly issued commission that is signed by the president and the Secretary of State. We got the warrant, stamped on it that you have that gives you a tenure there. And it was the oddity that to be removed, a random person in the White House that no one has ever heard of could suddenly just send an email and you're removed. And, it seems a little bit odd that would be the process that you would go through. But nonetheless, that's what happened.
Well, so you got this random email and you thought, hey, this seems a little bit suspicious, like could be a phishing email. Like, how did you find out that it was legit?
Well, there were two other board members that also received the email, and ultimately we reached out to figure out whether it was legit, and we were told that it was.
So you just sort of described the process by which you were nominated and then confirmed, and then the White House sort of summarily dismisses you. That whole process seems, certainly unusual, and I've had a lot of experts tell me like that's plainly illegal. What's your view on that, and like what recourse do you have now that you are out?
Well, I think it's helpful to contextualize the history of the PCLOB. The PCLOB was established following a recommendation of the 9/11 Commission in 2004. It was actually originally established in the executive office of the president. And at the time, there were two presidentially appointed Senate confirmed members and three members that could just be appointed by the president. And all members explicitly by statute served at the pleasure of the president. In its first iteration, all of the board members, with the exception of one, were Republican. This was during the Bush administration. All but one were Republican. And in one of the reports, I think the first report that the PCLOB did, the White House counsel's office sought to substantially revise the report and ultimately because you work in the White House, you go through the process for review for any document that you want to put out through the White House. Lanny Davis, then the only Democrat that was actually on the board, there were 4, so it wasn't 3-2, it was a 4-1. Lanny Davis resigns in protest over the lack of independence of the PCLOB. It is that resignation that led to the reconstitution of the PCLOB in 2007. When it was reconstituted, it was pulled out of the White House, pulled out of the executive office of the president. It was established as an independent agency. All 5 board members were established as presidentially appointed and Senate confirmed. The president was explicitly required to consult with the Democratic leadership, in this case, the opposition leadership, for nominees. They were meant to serve fixed terms of 6 years, which gets you over 2 administrations. The people that were appointed were explicitly, by statute, it says, explicitly told, shall not be appointed on the basis of partisan affiliation. It's written into the statute. And then when you look at the mandate for the agency, the very first thing that it says when it says the board shall review proposed legislation. Well, that's kind of odd in the executive branch, is that the first thing that an executive branch agency would do is advise Congress there. So you end up with this second feature. What it didn't do, though, is it was silent. It's silent on removal. However, you have to consider it in the context of the statute that was the prior iteration of it, where everyone served at the pleasure of the president. That was taken out of the statute by Congress intentionally when it designed an independent agency.
So what does that mean for you now? Like, could you sue to try and get your old position back?
I am definitely looking at legal options and considering what the next step would be.
Okay, so you wrote an op-ed for The Guardian, and the headline to that was, "Trump fired me, now it will be easier for the government to spy on Americans." What kind of abuses keep you up at night? And do you worry that, what used to be incidental collection of U.S. person data might soon become targeted collection of U.S. person data?
So one of the requirements on the PCLOB is that we all have top secret security clearances. So I have to balance the answer to your question about what keeps me up at night with what I can speak about publicly. I do think that there are several projects right now that the PCLOB is actively working on that do keep me up at night and make me concerned. One of those projects is one that many people in this room probably know a lot about, which is Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which will go up for reauthorization in, I think, April of 2026. That is a critical and indeed, one of the feature projects that the board has historically been involved in. It's one that at the end of last year, the board voted to approve a new project into it. I led the effort to do that. It was not a unanimous vote. It was a 3-1 vote. One member voted against it. The idea that we would not have the PCLOB on the beat when Section 702 is up for reauthorization keeps me up at night. There are changes, reforms that were mandated the last time it was reauthorized. There are concerns about incidental collection that continue to exist, U.S. person queries that continue to exist. I think it's absolutely critical that the PCLOB have a role doing that, and I hope that the prior opposition that was to Section 702 will not end up killing the report. A second example that keeps me up at night is another project that we opened at the end of last year into tactical terrorism response teams as part of CBP, Customs and Border Protection. For those who don't know much about them, this is an elite unit, I guess, within CBP that works at the border to conduct surveillance, counterterrorism, using a lot of surveillance techniques such as accessing phones. It's the border, and at the border, there is less protection. I am particularly concerned about the extent to which there may be coordination between CBP and the FBI or other agencies, for example, at the border, and using that for counterintelligence or for other purposes, including of U.S. persons, not just of foreigners that are crossing the border. And obviously, with all the attention to the border right now, that's a heightened area of surveillance concern.
So both in your experience and then also we've seen, President Trump try to remove the chair of the Federal Election Commission. What does your experience mean for other independent agencies? What can we expect, for their independence and their ability to operate, given that the PCLOB itself is, I guess, not a full quorum right now?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because to me it really goes to the essence of what is an independent agency and why do we have them? What value do they add? Right? Independent agencies historically have been useful because they are insulated from the political process and thus are able to make recommendations or decisions without having to fear that the decision that they're making is going to automatically remove them from office, or having to vet everything that they do with the current administration. It allows expertise in highly sophisticated areas to be brought to an agency. And it allows a diversity of views to be aired so that all of those views can be seen or observed or taken into account in decision making. If independent agencies no longer exist in this country, if everyone ultimately ends up serving at the pleasure of the current administration, we lose the benefit of expertise. We lose the benefit of independence, and where independent agencies get their strength is not because there's someone at the top that somebody else trusts. It is that both sides, both parties, they all feel like their views are aired. And that trust in and of itself is what gives them power. So when you take that away, when you take away the minority side, when you only give one stream of information and communication, it calls into question whether you're getting the true story, and it calls into question the credibility of the ultimate decisions or recommendations that are coming out of the agency. So my fear is that in a lot of heavily regulated spaces, privacy is just one. Transportation, elections is another. Energy, in a lot of these spaces, the economy, consumer financial products, that all of that gets called into question, and that ultimately you have a stable source of regulatory guidance that is undermined and taken away.
And ultimately, the bottom line for the American, the average American citizen, the American consumer, that not having independent agencies working on their behalf kind of removes a path of redress for them, right? Like if they have a concern, what's left? Congress and the courts, right?
Yeah, I mean, you would have Congress and the courts, and obviously there's still value in transparency. So the fourth branch of government, which you know quite well, the media as well, continues to serve a function.
But as we've seen, President Trump appears to be interested, if not, openly willing to flout court orders. And a lot of people have been talking about just this week whether we may be in a constitutional crisis with the administration either about to refuse or refusing to respect the power of the judiciary. What does that mean in the context of surveillance oversight if the administration is not willing to respect the power of the courts?
A lot of the surveillance programs and activities that we certainly looked at the PCLOB, they never find their way to a court. Some do, but not the majority of the kinds of things. They never quite make it there. And so what I think the value is of oversight agencies is that, and oversight authorities, is that they are able to address issues of abuse or unlawful activity or waste outside of the judicial process, and even in addition to the congressional oversight process. There is great value in having that, that mechanism there that doesn't have to wait on a case to be able to investigate a matter and take action where appropriate.
So we've so far been talking purely about the United States and what's happening within the United States, but obviously, our approach to the PCLOB and its work and its impact reaches far beyond the United States. Tell me a little bit about how, in your conversations, folks across the Atlantic and Europe are thinking about what's happening here, about the gutting of PCLOB. What this might mean for the future of EU-US data transfers. What can you tell us about that?
There's a real concern in Europe that the gutting of the PCLOB will ultimately end up calling into question the integrity of the data privacy framework that permits data flows between Europe and the United States. I have now been in, 4 or 5, I can't remember right now, annual reviews that are done between the Europeans and the United States that look at the Privacy Shield or the data privacy framework. The US government gets great value in being able to explain the independent oversight processes that take place with regard to federal surveillance activities. And the PCLOB has been, in my entire time on the PCLOB, a full 100% feature of the US case that it makes to establish that we do have independent oversight of our surveillance authorities. In fact, it is because of the the annual review with the Europeans that in 2018, 3 board members were confirmed to give us a quorum literally the day before they got on a plane to fly to Europe to actually attend the data privacy, the Privacy Shield annual review. The board plays a role not only in identifying judges and special advocates and passing those names on to the Attorney General, for example, but in annually reviewing and certifying the redress program that is part of it. The concern is that to the Europeans, if there is a perception that the PCLOB isn't independent, that the names that it's setting forth are not actually independent, but really the names the administration wants, that the board will certify whatever the administration tells it to certify, that it is part of the administration, that it can't be trusted and it loses that value. And it's not just the PCLOB that is called into question. It's actually the Data Protection Review Court that's called into question as well and is another feature of the review. And we've already seen one resignation publicly of the special advocate in connection in the last couple weeks. I suspect that more resignations will become public in short order. And when you have a combination of removals from the PCLOB, resignations from the Data Protection Review Court, one can't help but wonder about the future of the data privacy framework.
So I wasn't here earlier this morning, but apparently Beth Williams was, and I'm told that her message to this audience was essentially everything will be fine. Do you have a response to that?
We've spoken a bit during this conversation about how the real the key value of the PCLOB is its independence and the diversity of views it can put forward. If there's a perception that the PCLOB is working at the behest of the administration, it's not really independent, and it's approving everything, then it undermines the whole value of it. And you start to wonder, well, what's the difference between the PCLOB and the Intelligence Oversight Board that's already within the White House? But moreover, the PCLOB right now is operating with one part-time board member, not a full-time board member, a part-time board member who may or may not live in New Jersey part of the time, and is not able to be operational at full time. So even if you have an expert staff, I don't know that there's a commitment that whatever report the expert staff puts out is the report that goes out, and it won't be line edited by one person becoming essentially that one person's report. And so the concern I have is even if the staff are able to prepare a report that Beth is willing to put out under her name, that's just one individual's views on a very thorny topic that could greatly benefit from a diversity of perspectives.
I want to open it up to questions from the audience in just a couple minutes, but before I do, a few more from me. One, do you have any thoughts on President Trump's nominees for DNI and FBI director?
I do not have any thoughts.
Okay. If you want to revisit that, I'm okay with that at any point.
Well, here's what I will tell you. The P Club does interact with him, and this actually goes to your prior question as well. The P Club meets regularly with the heads of agencies in the intelligence community. And when there's a disagreement, those meetings flare up a little bit more, say in the Section 702 context. It's very hard if you disagree with the administration, especially if it's your own administration, and I say that as someone who did it, to show up in a skiff and debate the Attorney General for 2 hours on a particular legal issue. It is very hard to show up at the White House in the Roosevelt Room and to be seated across from the White House counsel, the National Security Council, the Deputy Attorney General, the Vice President, and the President, amongst others, and to stand up and say, I disagree with you. That is extremely hard to do. And if you are one person trying to do it and your party is the one that's in control, it gets even harder to do. So I raise, my fear is that when you know those dynamics, it makes it very difficult to be able to proceed by yourself on a part-time basis.
One more from me. So, you were alluding just now to how difficult it can be to stand up to your own party. Right now, you're a Democrat. Democrats are kind of in a crisis right now. They're trying to figure out how to respond to the current administration. What guidance would you give your fellow party leaders, in this moment? What do you hope will happen?
Well, I hope that we, in short order, can return to a time where independent agencies have quorums and where the views of Democrats, as they are required by statute, are included. There's a part of me that wonders whether the approach the Democrats ought to take ought to be the same as with the Tennessee Three, which is they were expelled, and what do? They got sent right on back shortly thereafter. And so my hope is that we can return to a quorum and where the minority views are present. And I also, I also wonder whether even those folks, sort of have to be confirmed again. I don't know the answer to that, or whether if they were previously there, you could just rename them and put them back. And there's no stigma to really take from it. It's perfectly okay to understand at the very beginning of the administration you're trying to get a control of everything, and then once you've got control, you're like, okay, let me get things back to the way to operational efforts. And the Democrats hopefully can be supportive in having all of us who were removed return to our roles in line with our respective positions.
So if President Trump tomorrow said, actually, we want you back on the P Club, what would your response be?
The president nominated me twice in his first administration. I took up the call to service for him, and I would continue to take up the call for service.
Any questions from the audience at this point? Feel free to come on up. I think there are mics on either side. Travis, we've got just a couple more minutes left, but I wonder if you might say a little bit more about what you hope to do next. If you do, let's supposing President Trump doesn't have a sudden change of heart and ask you back.
I'm considering options right now. I don't have a final decision on that yet, but it is not lost on me that no action or just kind of moving on essentially affirms the ability of any future president to remove board members of the P Club. And that's important because if you think about 4 new nominees showing up and getting confirmed, getting their commissions, what would stop the president on day one from telling the 2 Democrats that are there, thank you for your service. It's been a nice couple hours. You are dismissed. Right? This process repeats itself. So either we are committed to independence or we're not committed to independence, but I don't think you get to have it both ways. Either the P Club ultimately becomes part of the administration, in which case I question what's the difference between it and some other advisory boards or oversight boards that are out there, or we take advantage of the expertise that a board of diverse perspectives that would serve cross administrations and can bring a lot of knowledge. I mean, I served on the board for 6 years. There's a lot of knowledge and information there that 4 new people have to completely get up to speed on. And if they all just serve just for a couple of years and they're gone, it makes it a challenge to be able to operate. And keep in mind that it's hard enough to get through a normal appointment and confirmation process, but you're also dealing with people who have security clearances and expertise in a relatively unique area of law that almost requires you to, you have to have expertise in privacy or law and policy, expertise in national security. There aren't 1,000 people out there that have all of that such that you could turn them over every 4 years.
Yeah. Do you think that eliminating the P Club or making it rendering it ineffective, that undermines national security?
I think it undermines privacy and civil liberties for sure, and confidence that the executive branch can appropriately ensure that it is complying with the law, the Constitution, as well as reasonable expectations. I think it also adds a challenge when you consider in the context of everything that's happening, right? The P Club is just one component of oversight in our broader system. Inspectors general are another component of oversight, right? The Data Protection Review Court would be another component. Congress, right? And when you see that, changes across a large number of these, then you start to really question the extent to which the executive branch is able to adequately and confidently police itself.
I think that's about all we do have 30 seconds. Oh, I think that is about all the time that we have today. So Travis, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian.